And so Kichigami is very similar to Gichigumi. It's just a different dialect. It means big water. And Sigwan translates to the season of spring. And so this lake was called by the natives Big Lake in the season of the spring. And I think you look at that lake, and there's the lake very clearly defined, but then there's marsh on all four sides of it, essentially. And it was drained. The outlet is a very straight, narrow channel. And I suspect that before it got drained, every spring during the high waters, this lake would essentially double or triple in size. And that was and so the natives, they saw that, they respected that, and they decided to name the place after that phenomenon. So that was a really amazing find to me. Down here, Sand Lake was, and then this is a fable and a lot less identifiable as truth, but there's stories that lake was called Angel Lake by the natives because there was always a calm spot on the lake. And so I just thought that was an interesting tidbit. I really can't verify that at all, but we got to have a little bit of fun with it. Another really interesting thing, the native name of the River Raisin, stretching all the way down to Monroe, was Numasippi, which means the river of sturgeon. And so the slow-moving river provided really awesome breeding grounds for sturgeon. And apparently it was a good place to go fishing for sturgeon, and so they named the river after that. And actually, if you go down to Clinton and Tate Park is this very large, now very fairly developed park that's lots of flat land right there around the river. And before settlers came in and drained all this land, that whole flatland would flood during the spring waters in huge, like acres and acres and acres of slow-moving water that was just amazing breeding ground for sturgeon. So you can imagine that a few hundred years ago there were a lot of people fishing in that area. Let's see. One thing you may have noticed when I was zoomed out a little bit more is here we have Manchester. And really, in all my research, there's not much trail, or there's not much evidence of Native Americans in this circle north and east of Sharon Hollow or Manchester. And I really think that's because there aren't many major waterways in that area. But here on Iron Creek, you have running this way and all these chains of lakes in the Irish Hills. You know, their existence was really focused and reliant on water for travel, for food, for water. So they didn't spend much time up here except maybe to hunt because there was no water to sustain them, essentially. So we really find that, and I've found that most of Manchester area history comes from the southwest corner of Manchester Township and southwest of Manchester because of that water, those water features. You know, of course, Saline was famous for its salt springs. A lot of not only prey going to get salt, but also natives wanting to use salt would all converge there. And it was right along 12. I don't think that's a coincidence that this major path or highway went right by this really valuable resource. I mean, where, if you couldn't go to the store, could you get salt nowadays? Nowhere. Yeah?
I heard something interesting about Saline. I always thought the salt was used for, food preparation and preserving food. And it's probably partly true, but I also read that the animals, as you mentioned, would come and get the salt.
Mm-hmm.
And while the deer or whatever were getting their salt, they were easy targets
Mm-hmm.
for the Indians to get their meat.
Yeah, definitely. Very much so. And I think it was a double case of...
Just sit in one spot and pick off the food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Preserve it, kill it.
Yeah, Saline is also noted as a safe area where there could be bitter enemies shoulder to shoulder
Mm-hmm.
with salt, and they
Yeah.
were not allowed to fight.
Yeah, because it was such a valuable resource, definitely.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
I didn't know that.
You have the two Indian trails going down to each side of River Raisin.
Uh-huh.
Which is the two tribes? Because I can never remember. But Wasn't it one tribe used one side and the other used the other side?
I've read that.
Yeah,
One was Sauk and the other one was Potawatomi.
Yeah. And I have it marked on here.
Showed the two separate trails going down.
Yeah, and so the one that is on the north and east side is technically the Potawatomi, but I think that's really a case of there was no, this is this tribe's trail and this is that tribe's trail. It was, everybody used it interchangeably, you know. I think it was really a case of when the first settlers moved to the area, there happened to be a lot of Potawatomi and that they saw walking up and down that trail, so they called that the Potawatomi Trail. So, I guess I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to hear more stories. I don't have too much more without getting into really kind of stories.
What does it mean on your map with the white circles?
Oh, that's just, I can edit it. See, I can put the trail up there.
Oh, I see.
That's just.
It's just a computer feature.
Yep.
Do you have any pictures of the rice by the Sharon Mills? That's the first I've ever heard of it, and I wouldn't know what it looks like.
Yeah, I do not have pictures of it personally, and it essentially looks like a tall grass growing out of the water, and it is very much out of the water. It thrives in areas where you have about 3 to 4 inches of water flowing over really mucky bottom. So.
Looks like ornamental grass.
Yeah, exactly. It has a really fluffy head for all that rice. And I think it's the kind of thing where if you were to go up that stretch of the river, there's nothing else that looks like it really. And that's how I first noticed it. You know, I hadn't really heard about, like, the closest wild rice was, you know, up near like the middle. And I had never seen any, but I was just paddling along one day and I said, I suspect that's wild rice, and I went and got somebody who knew what they were talking about and brought them out, and they confirmed it for me.
If you do another show, it'd be nice if you had a picture of it, too.
Yeah, that's true.
Whatever.
That's true, yeah.
Does the Sharon Hollow path, does it follow Pleasant Lake Road, or does it go along by the river?
It goes along by the river. But, yeah, it goes along the river right there. But I also suspect that, you know, there was so much that the first people who were recording this information didn't get. And I think that there's probably a trail running along the eastern edge of the Sharon Short Hills. Just because you're trying to get north from here, and that's, at the time, a fairly impassable, not impassable, you can walk through those hills, but if you're a tribe trying to move a small village or something, a little family band, you don't want to be dragging your kids over all these hills. It's like no fun, so we're just going to walk along the kind of flat land around it.
Two questions. First, you mentioned the Iron Creek, how their native word translated to iron.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if iron was not part of the domestic product, how did they recognize the element?
I think it's a case of they just recognize that there's a lot of this red substance coming out of the ground, and they called that red substance Bialecki. And the settlers came along, knew what it was, and said, oh, we call that iron. So it wasn't that they knew what iron was.
And secondly, back to Uma, maybe we can find her on the haunted tour.
In the green?
Your green line that comes out of Pittsfield Charter Township,
Uh-huh.
that sort of follows then Textile Road?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, there's a where Textile Road split off from 12 was a Native American encampment. I can't call it a village. A lot of what we call villages were actually probably more encampments. It was a place to stay for a day or two. And so yeah, it actually came on the very west end of Weber Road, right before it hits into Steinbach, is actually a road that mirrors the exact path of the trail, the west end of Weber. Yep. And actually, what is it? Sanborn, the very west end of Sanborn is also, you'll drive along Sanborn, it's pretty straight east and west. You get to the west end and it becomes very curvy. And that's also almost a direct mirror of the original trail that was there.
That's why I've always personally believed Austin Road is further.
Yeah, yeah,
Just because if you go between Austin Road and go south down to where 12 is,
uh-huh.
all those other roads are arrow straight and they go through wetlands.
Yeah,
And I just can't picture going from Saline west and walking through a swamp. When you did.
yeah. Well, that was the Europeans and their we can plow through anything. They built those roads.
I'm talking the natives. I would have stayed up high along Austin Road where the ground wasn't wet.
Yeah, certainly, certainly. Yeah, in the back?
Do you look for anything besides mounds when you're looking for trails?
I very rarely look for mounds. I assume that most of them have been destroyed.
So you're looking for trails, you look for other things?
Yeah, I'm looking for literal depressions in the ground. It's just so many years of walking there have pressed the earth down.
Well, I worked for the Canal Indian Nation for 12 years, and one presentation they had was the Native Americans used trees. They would twist the branches around or various things to mark the trails.
Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. So, wow, thank you for reminding me, because this is another super cool. Long before I really knew about these trails, I had heard accounts of a crooked or bent tree outside one of the English family's houses on English Road. And so I found where that family's settlement was, and I marked a little tree spot there. And then later I came in and filled in these trails, and that tree is right in this crook of the trail here. It's right there. Actually, probably if I bring up another layer, it'll be on there. But right there is a very clear case of the trail curves south there, and they had a tree there to mark that. And even down just south of Wampler's Lake, there's a road. I mean, it's a lane really. That's called it's like Indian Tree or Crooked Tree Lane. From that, and I'm sure that's a holdover from those days.
Is the Tecumseh Mountain still there?
It is not. We know exactly. I can zoom in on it. Oh, I gotta bring up that layer again. So here we are looking at Tecumseh. Let's see, what's this one? Okay, yeah. So this dot right here, the Tecumseh Dance Ground, that is the exact location of where that of where those mountains were. I mean, we still have that knowledge, and unfortunately, they're being completely obliterated. I think there's not even a trace. And you know, this is called Indian Crossing Trails Park, because I think near Tecumseh there was a more permanent settlement to some degree, because of how notable this mound was and how much of a cultural site it was. So, yeah, this is just to orient us a little bit. I zoomed in a little bit too much. Here's downtown Tecumseh. Here's 50 coming in across. Here's Evans Street that goes up to Clinton. And so this is Globe Mill Pond, I believe it's called. No, this is Globe Mill Pond. I forget what that one's called. But it's just off of North Evans Street to the east there.
Just off North Evans?
Yeah. Let's see, I don't know the name of that road. Maybe if we zoom in enough.
Milwaukee.
Yeah, Burt Street and Milwaukee Road. So, and I'm some of you are obviously familiar with it. You go by here and there's probably a big sloping off to your to the south, and that mound would have been just at the bottom of that hill. Oh. Yeah.
Silas, do you know if the early New England settlers or American settlers would ever put their own burial grounds where next to or where the Indians had their burial grounds? Do you know of any examples of that? I
don't know that. No, I haven't looked into that at all. I know Ray knows a lot about burial grounds, settler burial grounds in the area, and maybe if we were to confab for a little bit, we could come up with something. But
I've not heard of
yeah,
sharing burial grounds.
Yeah?
Those of us that went to the Tecumseh Historical Museum for a tour last year, they were talking about the dancing grounds that you pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely famous because that's where Tecumseh had all of the eastern tribes meet before 1812 when they were trying to fight the American settlers, and that was the grounds they used because Tecumseh at that time was like a hub of where all these Indian trails came together.
Yeah, no, I think it is the kind of thing where we don't even realize how significant of a spot this was. Yeah, Ray?
I just want to add a couple of things that are now online if you want to research this further. When Orange Risden was commissioned by the U.S. government to survey Salt Trail, US 12, he and John Gilbert paired together to do the survey work from Detroit to Chicago of what is now US 12. And his survey records, his notes are now online. There's a website where you can look at them. And you can see with precision exactly where he surveyed. So that one little bump that Silas showed there where it came off US 12 and came off the Podunk. We talked about it a few months ago with Podunk. The actual Native American trail broke off from what is now US 12 and came up through Podunk and then angled back down to the southwest. And as you mentioned, politics got involved and they ended up not using that route. But those maps are online. They're extremely detailed. They are Orange Risden's actual survey notes, so they are accurate. He was following the trail and marking exactly where it was. So we can now trace exactly where those trails are. Also, the individual surveyors who did each of the townships, 1818, 1819, 1824, those records are now also online. The state of Michigan's put them all online. So you can look up Manchester Township, for example, Township 4 South, Range 3 East, they'll call it. And you can see the map the surveyor made, and you can read all of his notes. And you can see where he's talking about a trail has crossed here or something relevant that he's put in the notes because the government wanted to know about that. And so you can take a while to read online because it's 19th century script.
Yeah, I was going to say it's...
We did a project at Iron Lake here several months back. There was a person interested in the history of Iron Lake. Was Iron Lake natural or was it man-made? And we found the surveyor actually writing in there, traversing along the Marseille. He's describing in great detail the circumference of the lake, the shape of the lake, what it looked like. It was a natural lake, but it was much smaller than it is now because the dam wasn't in the creek yet. So those two resources online can do a lot to help you find tracing evidence of Native American settlements or trails and the original US 12 route. So it's on there.
Yeah.
The question about Austin Road, I think Austin Road follows section lines coming out of Saline. I think that the eastern part of Austin from where it actually hit US 12 out maybe to about, I don't know, somewhere by Dave's house there.
Bridgewater.
Well, yeah, I think that's a man-made road because it sits on a section line.
Same with those corners, they're all section corners.
They're following the section line, but then when you get west of that, it starts to do the wavelength.
They're following the river.
They're following the river, and but to answer the question somebody brought up, the survey that Orange Risden did is online. It's a website coming out of Detroit because this man has traced the actual notes for US 12, Grand River, different roads coming out of Detroit. He's got them all surveyed out, so that's an excellent resource to use also.
Cool. Any other questions before I have closing? Yes, Celia?
Oh, I just have this burning idea about the Raisin River. I've heard that it's been really, it's real meandering.
Mm-hmm.
And trying to understand with geologic time, or this time period that we're talking about, is that a big enough time that the river would have taken a different course over the times that you're talking about, the Indians and the early settlers?
Yeah.
Is that happening then, or was that something that happened longer ago?
As far as I know, the course has stayed pretty well, apart from like the individual meanders, for the last couple thousand years.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And that's in those notes that are online. You can see the river exactly. Yeah. Surveyors had to give it exactly.
Yeah. And so I think that the very initial, like when the glaciers first retreated, there's probably a good 1,000 years where the river kind of really got a little wonky. Yeah, exactly, matured. But I think it's been pretty stable for a while now. There was a question in the back I saw. Maybe somebody? Yeah?
I was just going to kind of inquire, now with the trails used seasonally, how did the Indians travel? In a pack, to go out on a hunt, or did the whole families, tribes? Basically, who would walk on the trail at the same time?
Yeah, all of the above. So Native Americans were a very migratory people. You know, there are accounts of in summer they would go up to the Sault Ste. Marie area and fish for the summer, but then come wintertime they would head south to more hospitable weather essentially. And different tribes had different seasonal cycles, and so really pinning it down to any one thing is pretty hard. But there's definitely a combination of one or two hunters moving through, as well as whole families or bands coming through as well. And maybe, it could be that in fall time, when hunting is maybe a little bit better, the families were pretty settled at that point. So you wouldn't necessarily have hunters passing by families. I'm sure it did happen, but I think it's a case of once or twice a year, whole bands would move on the more major trails that are mapped out across the whole state. And then like a lot of these, like this little squiggle right here, this came from a map made by Helen Rosenkrantz. Ray just forwarded it to me recently. And it's such a in between all these pretty major trails that I can't imagine that there was huge families moving down that trail on a regular basis. So
I ran across a tale by an early settler in the Podunk and Clinton area, saying that they witnessed a band of 600 Indians moving through at some fall. And so, the government and some of the Indians would sign a treaty, and the Indians were all supposed to leave, but a lot of them just didn't leave and just didn't cause trouble, so they stayed.
Yeah.
But, eventually they left, but...
Yeah. There's also the case that a lot of those treaties that happened, they said, you give us your land, we'll give you goods, but you have to go to Fort Malden in Canada on the far side of Detroit to get those goods. So even after settlers had settled in the area and pushed the natives out, these natives still had to trek from their reservations in Iowa or wherever. They had to trek, however many hundreds of miles to Fort Malden in Canada across the Detroit River.
Or they may have been a band that didn't even know there was a treaty.
Yeah, that's true too.
When were these tribes forced out of this area? Was anything like a trail of tears for these tribes?
To some degree. But let's see, I have a note here. Around the turn of the century, 1700s going into the 1800s, approximately. I mean, it wasn't really until the Revolutionary War happened and American settlers started coming across, or at least the government was preparing for settlers to come. The canal, Erie Canal, wasn't opened until, can somebody help me? 1836, thank you. So I think the American government, in preparation for settlers coming, kind of started that process. But like I said, I think 1807 was the last treaty that dealt specifically with Washtenaw lands, but in 1821 there's the Chicago Treaty, which nullified all land titles south of the Grand River. So.
That was 1821?
Yep, the Chicago Treaty.
Backing up about the bands moving, well, the hunter-gatherers were the earliest ones, and they'd move along until they found a really good spot to settle down. But later, the more established tribes that actually had villages, they would have contingencies go out for certain things, and they'd take kits with them. So they would pack a kit that would be for what they were going for. And you would find a collection of artifacts that were specifically listed. It looks like they're here for ducks. No, they're here for deer. No, they're here for fish, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So, and that just showed that those people moved specifically for that, and then they take everything home, but they wouldn't carry all the kind of arrowheads and hooks and everything wherever they went.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Look at the map. East of Schneider Road, the road Austin goes straight east. It goes
Mhm.
along section lines or township lines.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, this is probably outside the scope, but the road that's going northeast, southwest, between Britain and Tecumseh,
Uh-huh.
that's the Ridge Road.
Mm-hmm.
And it follows the old shoreline of Lake Maumee.
Mm-hmm.
People I've known from that area say that they find artifacts all the time
Oh, yeah.
on the west side, on
Yeah.
the shore side,
Yeah.
because there were bands of Indians moving up and down that area too. And I'm sure that had some effect as far as moving as far as Manchester too.
Yeah, certainly.
But they might have branched out
Yeah.
from there.
Yeah. And I think it's a case of, even after Lake Maumee receded, the area in the old lake bed was still pretty marshy relatively and wet. And so this was as close as you could get to going through the area while still having a high ground to walk on. And so I'm sure there was a trail going along that, what's now the Ridge Road.
Yeah, it was marshy down as far as Riga
Mhm.
in particular, but that's what the atlases said. The whole area was marshy full of mosquitoes that kept people from pushing north into
Mhm.
Michigan and settling
Yeah.
west instead.
Yeah. In the green? Yellow?
I just wanted to make a comment, down in Hillsdale County, off of 127 that goes down, that divides Lenawee County and Hillsdale County. I don't remember the name of the road, but there's a plaque that indicates the last group of Indians that had left the state of Michigan. I believe the date was like 1823, and so
Yeah.
that plaque is there.
Wow.
I just can't remember the name of the crossroad.
Yeah.
Squaw Field.
That would probably be it, Squawfield
Yeah,
Road,
huh.
yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and so that was probably the last tribe that left on an official, because I'm quite certain they were coming back for their treaty supplies, but they were the last tribe to leave and say, like, we're leaving having seceded our lands. Mm-hmm.
I have read, I don't have all the details in memory, but I have read that like in the late 1820s, early 1830s, before our town was settled, that a lot of the Native Americans left, but there were still some here. And the last group left around 1840s, and they were sent to reservation camps out of state.
Yeah, interesting. And that could have been a case of they largely tried to adopt
Yep.
American, or not American, but European culture, and so were allowed to stay in the area essentially.
And then eventually were packed up and sent out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if there's no more questions, just like I say, thank you for coming. If you want any of those, I have a list of different resources that I've used to research. If you're interested in any of that, I'm happy to make up a list for you and send it to you. I also, if you have artifact collections from the local area, I'd love to see them. Just for my own research purposes. I don't want any of it, I just want to see it. Also, if you have stories or any more information that you don't necessarily want to take the time up here to talk about, or that kind of a thing. I'd love to talk more about this, because I think really there's so much more to learn. I've really only scratched the surface. And so if any of you have more information or would like to know more, please feel free to come talk to me. I'd really appreciate that. And lastly, so since I gave this talk 2 years ago, I was paddling along the River Raisin just north of Clinton at River Bend Preserve, and I found this point right on the bank of the river. It was just like lying there like that as I was paddling along. I was lucky to spot it as I paddled by.
Did your dad? Yeah, did your dad?
So this point is dated to almost 4,000 years ago. And back on that table back there, there's two collections from different farms. And there's a calendar back there with different eras of stone points, essentially. So if you want, you can try and go date some, but there are, in those two collections, points going back to 9,000 years ago. There are only the two oldest types of points that aren't represented in those collections up until basically the settlers came in. So I think that's a really cool, awesome thing. And that's proof that, you know, even in this area, 9,000 years ago, people were dropping their keys. So, thank you.